recording. I like how they've started warning you that it's recording now. All right, so let's talk about Azure Event Hubs. So my name's Eugene Meidinger, and I'm realizing that my title just says Azure Event Hubs. So I'm a professional speaker, I swear. So this is an introduction to Azure Event Hubs. So the goal of this talk is going to be that by the end of it, you have an idea of what Azure Event Hubs is for, what it's not for, and a general idea of how you might provision an event hub, talk to it, that sort of thing. We only have like 7 folks, and it's a user group. So if you have any questions, feel free to just unmute yourself and interrupt me. I'm pretty unflappable at this point, so unless someone starts like cussing me out, I think we should be good. So if you've got any questions, feel free to ask them if it's relevant to what we're talking about. Otherwise, I'll be happy to hang around afterwards and talk about, any questions about Power BI or what it's like to be a Pluralsight author or any of that kind of stuff. So, all right. And so quickly about me, do I have, no one needs to see that. There we go. Okay. So my job is weird. My job is weird because I have 2 different jobs. I work as a business intelligence consultant, and I specialize in Microsoft Power BI. And so I do reporting, I do architecture, all these sorts of things. And I definitely enjoy it. But my other job is Pluralsight author. And it's weird because for a while the 2 were in sync, because I was making content on Power BI and I was consulting on it, and all my effort was Power BI, Power BI, Power BI. And then at a certain point, Pluralsight didn't really need any more Power BI content. And so I have had to become a professional learner. And so, I make courses on Azure Event Hubs or Kafka streaming or all these types of things. And so it's interesting trying to balance those 2 worlds, but I really do enjoy it. I'm also one of the co-organizers for the GroupBy conference. We just uploaded all the videos from the most recent event. It's twice a year, and we're looking at kind of expanding what GroupBy means. If you have any questions and we don't answer them today, and you think, oh man, I wanted to ask Eugene that, my email is down there at the bottom, so is my Twitter. So please feel free to email me. Generally for me, if it's something where I'm helping the community and I can maybe write a blog post, I'm more than happy to just, answer any questions you have. If it's something where you need time on my calendar, that's when I start charging money. You know what I mean? So if you want me to say how high when you say jump, then there's a fee involved. But if you're like, hey, I have a question, can you get back to me in like a week? Just please feel free to email me. I'm always happy to help the community. So enough about me. I'm not the star of the show here. The star is Azure Event Hubs. So what are we going to talk about? My chihuahua is very excited, by the way. So the first question is, what is Azure Event Hubs? And this is important because in my experience, a lot of folks, if you're a DBA especially, you're used to this general purpose relational database. And in Azure, there's not general purpose anything, right? Like technically there is SQL Server, but they've moved away from the Swiss Army knife approach to the scalpel approach. They're like, okay, we're going to make all these specialized tools. But it's a problem if you're someone like me who doesn't know the difference between a Phillips and a flathead screwdriver. And that's not entirely true. I can't tell you the difference, but there was many years where I couldn't. And so you have the same problem in Azure. And even if you narrow it down to eventing or messaging, you still have the same problem, right? Because you've got Azure Service Bus, you've got Azure Event Hubs, you've got Azure Storage Queues, you've got Azure Event Grid, you've got IoT Hub. And so just with in-house solutions, you've got 5 different messaging solutions. So it's a problem. So we're going to talk about what is Azure Event Hubs and why would you use it and why would you not use it? Because it's, again, a specialized tool. We're going to talk about how it works, not necessarily behind the scenes, but just the architecture of it and how you're going to interact with it. We'll talk about some of the implementation details, some of the practicalities, and then I've got just a super simple demo Literally, I'll show you how to provision one, how to send events, read events, nothing particularly fancy going on there. Okay, so that's the agenda. So let's jump into it. And when I talk about stuff, you know, a question that's important to me is, why do I care, right? Why do I care about Azure Event Hubs? And the answer maybe you don't, but here's the problems that it solves. So first is the speed of data ingestion. Now, I don't like that term because to me, ingestion sounds a little bit too much like digestion, and that sounds a little bit too much like indigestion. But when you start to deal with big sums of data, especially streaming data, so fast moving data, suddenly you need a landing pad for that data so that you can process it in a reasonable time frame. Because if you're coming from a SQL Server background, then you're used to something called pessimistic concurrency. And the whole idea with pessimistic concurrency is we expect that the data that we're inserting is going to affect queries and other changes. So we're going to lock things, and you get locking and blocking. And normally that makes sense. For a transactional system, that makes perfect sense. But if you've got all this sensor data just flying in, then maybe a SQL database doesn't make sense. Maybe you're going to get too much locking and blocking. And so Azure Event Hubs can help you receive large quantities and fast quantities of data in a more manageable and scalable way. It also can help with the speed of data processing, and more so with the latency of data processing, right? Basically, Azure Event Hubs is designed to be fast. It's designed to be responsive because we're dealing with streaming data. And again, when you're dealing with a traditional relational database, that can be a concern. And so if you have lots of data coming in, or you have data coming in fast, or you need to be responsive, Azure Event Hubs might be a solution for you. The other problem that it solves is true of messaging systems in general, in that it decouples reads and writes. And so what I mean by that is, if you've ever had to migrate an application and you had to update the connection string on each and every desktop, right? Or if you've ever had to migrate SQL or SharePoint server and you had to actually edit, you had to make a SQL alias, which is like a DNS entry just for SQL Server, then you know what the pain is whenever your reads and your writes are tightly coupled, right? When your producers and consumers are tightly coupled, migrations are a pain, right? But also think about the fact that we're entering a world of Kubernetes and containers and Docker and functions as a service and platform as a service and all this stuff, where you can spin up new applications whenever you want. And what you want then is a layer of indirection, right? You want the programs that are making the data to be completely unaware of the programs that are consuming the data, and vice versa. And so it allows you not only to decouple reads and writes in terms of space or programs on the network, but also in terms of time. One of the cool things with Azure Event Hubs is that you don't have to consume the data at the same point that it was created, or even close to it. You do have to deal with retention issues, right? So Azure Event Hubs will keep the data for 1 to 7 days. But I could create events today and then run an application to read those events tomorrow, and that's fine. No issues there. So Azure Event Hubs, in my mind, is a temporary home for your data. It is a place for the data to land and to briefly live, right? It is an airport for your data, but it is not the final destination, right? In fact, just like if you try to live in an airport for more than a day and you'll get kicked out, Azure Event Hubs will throw out your data. At the basic tier, the retention period is 24 hours. At the standard tier, it's 7 days. If you want to give Microsoft tons and tons and tons of money, you can go up to 90 days. But in general, you're looking at a week's worth of retention. And so Azure Event Hubs, what it solves is it's a temporary home for your data. It's a landing pad. So what does it not solve? Because one of the things that I get frustrated about whenever I hear about Microsoft technologies is, here's all the cool stuff it can do. It's going to slice bread and make you a sandwich, and it's going to file your taxes, and it's great. But again, if we're not talking about a Swiss Army knife, but a scalpel, well, you shouldn't cut your toast with a scalpel. You could, you might cut yourself. You shouldn't butter toast with a scalpel. You could, but you're not going to get a lot of butter on there. And again, you might cut yourself. So what are the things that Azure Event Hubs is not good at? And the first one, which was kind of already stated, is it's not good at long-term storage, right? It's designed to be bad at long-term storage because it's going to throw out your data after a certain number of days. It's also not a streaming analytics solution. It can't do any analytics on its own at all. I mean, there's some monitoring capabilities, so you can see the amount of activity that's just built into Azure, that's built on Azure Monitor. But Azure Event Hubs, you should think of it a lot like Azure Storage Blobs, but with a different set of constraints and guarantees provided than what you get with storage blobs, right? And so it's just a queue. It's just a big old list of data, and you can scan back and forth, but it's not going to be able to tell you, okay, how many events had this information or this data type or whatever. So you're going to need to depend on Azure Databricks or Azure Stream Analytics or something else to get any kind of analytics whatsoever. And as part of that, you don't get any ad hoc querying. So if you want to run a SQL query or an on-demand query of any kind, you're going to need another tool. So these are the problems that Azure Event Hubs does not solve. So let's talk a little bit more. What is an event? What's an event hub? All this kind of stuff. So what's an event? You know, it's an overloaded term. If you're used to programming, then it's when someone clicks on a button. You know, in layperson terms, like, you know, if you had a birthday, that's an event. An event is something that has happened in the past. And you may be thinking, Eugene, most things have happened in the past by definition, right? But the implication is twofold. So one, there's a timestamp, right? There's an event time. When did it happen? And then the other is that it can't be changed, right? This is not the latest Loki TV series where there's time travel involved. You can't change it. And, you know, this, as a database person, I'm like, wait. The whole point of a database is to change stuff, right? But if you think about it from a different angle, if any of you have ever had to work with a general ledger, right, or financial records for a company, if they need to cancel out a transaction, they don't delete it, right? They void it. They mark a little void flag, or they make another transaction to bounce it out, or what have you. You don't go in and change those things. That's called fraud, right? Same thing here. You should be thinking in terms of that, where it's similar to financial records, where it's like, look, you can add new records that say that you fixed it, but you can't change anything. Another thing is that these should be email sized, right? They're 1 to 2 kilobytes on average. Event Hubs does support up to a megabyte, just like how you can send megabyte sized pictures with your email, but this is how you get an email just folder just filled up, right? So events are small. They're little bits of data. And so that's the way that you want to be thinking about them. And then the last thing is they have arbitrary contents. Azure Event Hubs does not care in the slightest what's in your event. You're just giving it a big old bucket of bytes, and it's like, I'll get this to its destination. It's not looking inside. It doesn't know. It doesn't have any understanding. And so you can put in whatever you want. And so it's up to you to decide how you're going to encode whatever data you want to send. You could send plain text. You could send, you know, some sort of text-based format like JSON. You could send Avro, which is a more of a compressed format. It's up to you. It doesn't care. It's arbitrary. So these are some of the things that in my mind make up an event when it comes to event hubs and event streaming. So what's an event hub? How's that organized? Well, at the top level, you've got an Azure resource group. Technically above that is an Azure subscription, but my slide's not big enough. I couldn't fit it all in here. So we have an Azure resource group, which is just a container for Azure objects, right? Inside of that, we have an Event Hub namespace. So what's a namespace? It's not entirely intuitive, but the namespace part comes from the fact that whenever you create an Azure Event Hub namespace, you get a URL that's unique. You get a unique subdomain, technically. You get a connection string, right? And then you have control over some settings, especially around pricing. And so a namespace is basically an endpoint in a container. That's the way that I think about it. Is it's an endpoint. It's where you're going to point your programs to talk to your event hubs. And it's a container because it holds your event hubs and it holds settings for them that are applied at a group level. Related to a namespace is you're going to have producers and consumers. So you're going to have applications that are creating events all the time. And then you're going to have consumers that are consuming events all the time. And again, this is decoupled. The one doesn't know nor care about the other at all, which again allows for scalability on a number of different, pardon me, on a number of different levels. Inside of an event hub, the main things that you care about is there's partitions. So it's sort of horizontally, is horizontally partitioned the right term? It's broken up into parallel tracks of events that don't really care about each other, right? So you have these partitions and then you have offsets, because within a single partition, you are given ordering guarantees that basically, you know, things are just going to be incremented and appended, and it's always going to be in the same order. So that's what an event hub namespace, that's how it's all kind of laid out in my mind. So how does it work? How do we actually work with the data? So there's a 6 or 7 step process. It's pretty straightforward if you're using the libraries, although you don't have to. So the first thing is that the producer is going to create an event, right? And so you basically are doing something, whether that's a sensor reading or an error you want to upload or something. You're generating some kind of data. And then your application is going to wrap that in an event object. And you have to serialize your data. So what does that mean to serialize your data? Well, I'm giving this talk and I may have a bunch of thoughts all bobbing and weaving around in my head, but I can only say words in a linear order, right? I'm not a Mongolian throat singer that can make 2 different sounds at the same time, although that's super cool, right? And so I have to put my thoughts, which may be hierarchical, into a serial or a linear order, right? And so same thing here. You have to take what might be a computer object, a programming object, like if you've done object-oriented programming, and you have to squish that down into a set of bytes. So you have to serialize it, and how you do that is up to you. Azure Event Hubs does not care. And then you put that in a batch. And at some point, you're going to send the batch of events because it's faster and more effective to send not just one event at a time, but a whole batch of them. And it's sent to that namespace endpoint. So that's what happens on the producer side. Once the event is received, it's assigned to a partition. Now, by default, it's round robin. Basically, it's just an even spread. But if you wanted to, you could specify the partition, but then you may have some unevenness with how that's managed, right? So the events are assigned to partition, and they're given offset numbers within that partition. They're given, well, sorry, they're given sequence numbers for the sequencing, and then there's an offset, which is based on the space, if I recall correctly. The consumer can then say, hey, I want from this partition, this offset, I want this event. And the whole idea is generally that you're going to start at the beginning and you're going to work your way through and save your progress as you're going through each event. So you're going to checkpoint, and you have to write your own code for some of the checkpointing. Microsoft does provide a checkpointing library where you can save to Azure Blob Storage, but again, you're doing a lot of this on your own. And then finally, the data is either stored long-term with data capture functionality, or it's eventually removed via retention policy, or both, really. And so one way to think about all this is an Event Hub is a distributed commit log. So if you're coming from a SQL Server background, a database administrator background, then you're used to the transaction log, which is a serial set of events. It's stuff that's happened in the database. And in SQL Server, a transaction is not finished. It's not real until it's been hardened to disk, until it's been written to the transaction log, right? And so we have a very similar process with Azure Event Hubs, but it's distributed. It's spread across multiple partitions. And again, instead of just having SQL Server writing to the transaction log, we have multiple consumers and producers going on here. Another way to think about it is like if you've ever used Git, that is a commit log. You do some code and you commit, and it gets appended at the end. And it's also distributed because the data can be stored in multiple places. The difference is that when it comes to Git, it doesn't have to be linear, right? You can fork and branch and do all this kind of stuff. But one of the ways to think about Event Hubs is it's a distributed commit log. So let's talk now about just some of the general implementation details, some nitty-gritty kind of stuff, and then we'll have, like I said, just a very simple kind of demo. So there's 4 pricing tiers. I did not know about one of them until a couple of days ago because it's in preview. But first, there's the basic pricing tier, and this is like it's described. It's basic. You get 1 day of retention at most. I believe you can only go up to 1/4 of a megabyte for your event sizes, and it costs 1.5 cents per hour per throughput unit. Throughput unit is one of Microsoft's made up units of measurement, but it is tied to certain metrics of ingress and egress for the data. I really need to look it up, but I I think it's something like 1,000 events per second or a megabyte per second, whichever happens first. It's somewhere in that ballpark, but it's pretty easy to check out. And you can go anywhere from like 1 to 40 throughput units. So I only recommend the basic tier for playing around with Event Hubs and seeing if it makes sense for you. Then there's the standard tier. You get 7 days of retention. It costs twice as much, and you get features like Kafka support. Azure Event Hubs is intended to be a drop-in replacement for Apache Kafka. And while it doesn't have complete parity in terms of features, it does have protocol support. So if something can talk to Kafka, by and large, it can talk to Azure Event Hubs. It just may not be able to use some of the more advanced features. There's data capture. So now you can have it so you're writing your data out to Azure Blob Storage. And then you get 20 consumer groups. So a consumer group is a logical application ID for your consumers. And this is useful whenever you want to have a single logical application, but physically, maybe you have like 10 Docker containers or something that are each reading from a different partition for Azure Event Hubs. With basic, you only get the default consumer group. And then finally, there's premium and there's dedicated. And so premium is in preview, and I just kind of learned about it. In both cases, you can have up to 90 days of retention. For dedicated, you're paying a little bit under $7 per hour per compute unit, which is basically corresponds to a VM behind the scenes. Basically, you're paying Microsoft $5,000 a month to have your own dedicated VM, right? Premium is still more on the platform as a service side of thing. You have more connections, you have better performance. According to the documentation, they're using kind of a new 2-tier approach. I don't entirely understand from the documentation what that means, but they say it gives you better performance, right? So Premium is still in preview, but Dedicated's been out for a while. So 4 different pricing tiers. And what's frustrating is they all have different measurements. So basic and standard are based on throughput units, which is just ingress and egress, just data coming in and out. Premium is based on processing units, and dedicated is based on compute units. And so it's all these different units of measurement, unfortunately. Supported languages. So if you want full library support, there's 5 or 6 languages. Not included here is, I think, Apache Storm. But the main actual programming languages supported, there's .NET Core, which makes perfect sense because it's a Microsoft program. It's a Microsoft solution. There's also Java support, and Java is a popular language in the enterprise. It makes sense that Java will be supported whenever you're dealing with Kafka. Kafka is written in Java. And so it's just kind of a no-brainer. I personally have trouble writing in Java just because it feels like it feels like I'm wrestling with like a contract lawyer, and there's just always boilerplate or just issues that I run into. So I prefer to write in Python whenever I'm dealing with a lot of stuff like this personally. Java and Python are both very common languages in the data engineering world. So either one, is worth learning. There's support for JavaScript, which is interesting because to me, that says that they feel that people are going to be creating like analytics data or tracking data with websites and then using Event Hubs to record it, which makes sense. I could see that being a good use case. And then Go, which is a very low level language. And so it makes sense for like generating events and that sort of thing. In addition to supported languages, you could roll your own support. And so there's 3 protocols that are supported for Azure Event Hubs. So the first is the Advanced Messaging Queuing Protocol. All that you really need to know about this is that it's been around for decades, and it's a standard protocol if you want to do message queuing. And so you're going to find a number of libraries out there with support for this. There's also support for the Kafka protocol. Kafka is one of the most, if not the most popular Event Hub type program out there, right? So for event streaming, that kind of stuff, Kafka is really, really big. And then finally, there's HTTP support. So you could just roll your own, basically. A couple other things. Let's say you want to scale up, right? Well, there's 4 ways that you can do that. So the first is you can increase the number of producers. And there's no particular limit on that. You're going to be limited more by your throughput units. Basically, how much bandwidth at a time are you willing to support? And so you can go from 1 to, I think the last time I looked at it, up to like 40 throughput units. And again, the official documentation has numbers on what that corresponds to in terms of how many events per second. Again, I want to say it's 1,000, but I could be wrong on that. You can also set the number of partitions. You cannot change the number of partitions. So when you create an event hub, the number of partitions is set in stone. And you want to think about your partitions in terms of how many consumers you might have, right? Because the ideal is you've got, for a specific consumer group, for a specific logical application, you scale up to 1 consumer per partition. And so if you're only going to have 4 consumers under a consumer group, then it makes sense to have 4 partitions, right? So these are the 4 different ways that you can scale up. And Azure Event Hubs, because it's designed for a singular purpose, is very scalable and is quite performant. So we've talked about inputting, scaling, and then what about output? So we've got a couple output options. So the main one is Azure Blob Storage. So what's going to happen is if you're paying for standard, you can set up data capture, and it's going to write those events to the blob storage you specify, either at a given interval or a given size, whichever triggers first. And you can set both of those. And it's going to be writing the data in the Avro, AVRO format. Avro is a the way that I think about it, and you know, I wouldn't be surprised if I get corrected on this. I think it's like compressed JSON, because Avro is interesting in that it's got this plain text schema that's available that says, okay, here's how the data is going to be structured for the rest of this information, and then that information can be compressed potentially, or at least partially. Like we might get a chance to open up an Avro file and look at it in a text editor, and you can see some of the information, some of it, you know, you can't. And so if you're writing the blob storage, it's being written as an Avro file in a set of folders, and you can control the folder structure to a certain degree, which is neat. You can write to Azure Data Lake Gen 1 storage. Hopefully none of you are using Gen 1 storage because it's been replaced by Gen 2 storage. Now, what's interesting about Azure Data Lake Gen 2 storage, when I was making my course on Azure Event Hubs, I was shocked to find that it's just blob storage. It's Azure Blob Storage. This shouldn't even be a thing here because it's just blob storage. The difference is there's a little checkbox that says enable hierarchical namespaces. That's fancy code for turn on proper folder support, because Azure Blob Storage, I may be getting the technical name wrong, but it's an object storage kind of system. So it's really great for like files, but it's got a pseudo folder structure. And so the problem is, if you have a data lake and you're doing a lot of processing and you want to be able to like rename a folder, well, if you were just dealing with blob storage, you'd have to do this like scanning kind of operation, all this kind of stuff, or you'd have to change information in a bunch of places just to rename a folder, right? So Azure Data Lake Gen 2 is basically blob storage with proper folder support. Azure Stream Analytics can receive Event Hubs as an input. The support for that's really good. And then if you're using Azure Databricks, you can easily use one of the Java library to read in the data and do some analysis there. I mentioned before, the data is Avro data. So here's the schema from the documentation from Microsoft. And the important part that I want to talk about is basically, you know, this should kind of look, if you worked with XML or JSON, you kind of get the gist of what's going on here. But it's telling you, okay, what fields do we have? And basically, we've got a sequence number, we've got an offset, we've got when we received the event, we've got properties potentially, and then finally we have the body. And the body is just, the data type there is either empty or it's bytes, just a bunch of bytes. And again, Azure Event Hub doesn't care, right? So this is the schema for the data that gets saved to blob storage if you do data capture. So you'll have to learn about how to process Avro data if you want to work with the results of this. Another feature related to this is Schema Registry. So Schema Registry, it's still in preview. And the whole idea is, you know, I said you have to figure out how you want to serialize your data. And Azure Event Hubs doesn't care, but you know what does care? Your consumers and producers, right? And so you can reduce the load for serialization and deserialization, and you can validate that your data is in the right shape by using Schema Registry to hold those schemas of how, whatever way you're storing your data. Now, right now, it only has support for Avro schemas. I wouldn't be surprised if that changes at some point. But that's also a feature that's in preview. Whew. Okay, so we've got some super basic demos. Before I jump into that, does anyone have any questions at all on anything that was mentioned?
So you had mentioned, I think, that Azure Event Hubs is somewhat of a drop-in place for Kafka,
Yes.
right?
Mm-hmm.
But it doesn't have feature parity yet. Do you expect that they're heading towards feature parity at some point, or are they wanting to keep it not as advanced as Kafka?
Sure. No, that's a valid question. The impression that I got was that a lot of the features that they don't support are very kind of Kafka specific or fairly advanced, right? So the way that I would think about it is if you're talking to SQL Server, it supports ANSI SQL to a certain degree, but then it has a bunch of stuff specific to SQL Server, right? It's kind of like if they wrote something that could support basic SQL queries. So my expectation is that they'll continue to work on it some, but it's at a point where it meets what they wanted to do, which is basically to get something that can speak the Kafka protocol. It'll be able to write it to Azure Event Hubs. And then you run into some implementation details that are different. So for example, in Kafka, you can change the number of partitions for an existing Kafka topic, right? So no, my expectation is that they're aiming at good enough protocol parity, but there's always going to be features that they don't support, and that for most use cases, it's not going to be an issue.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. Any other questions before we hop over to the demo? All right. So, okay. So what we have here is we have the Azure Portal, and what we're going to do, don't get jealous, but I spoke to Cincinnati a couple days ago. But you know, I love Denver more. You guys have an amazing pedestrian mall in Boulder, Colorado 20 years ago. I don't know if it's still there or not, but it was great at the time.
Still there.
Yes, it was a good mall. So how do we create an event hub, right? So if I type in event hub, we're going to see, or hubs, we're going to see two main options, right? So we've got event hubs and event hub cluster. Cluster is the dedicated tier, and that's basically, again, behind the scenes, you're spinning up Azure VMs that's managed by Microsoft. So we want to create an event hub, and here we're creating a namespace. And so I'm going to put this under my little Pluralsight resource group, and the name has to be unique because you can see that it's a subdomain, right? So if I put testing, somebody's already taken that, right? But I can maybe do Denver, and I can decide which region that I want to put it in. And I can pick my pricing tier. And so we can see that the premium preview, I get 5 times as many consumer groups, and I get 10 times as many connections at any one time that I can have, right? So I'm just going to pick standard here, and I can pick how many throughput units I want. So I can go up to 40. I don't want that many. And you can enable an auto inflate, which is kind of funny because they'll increase the number of throughput units if you're hitting demand, but it's not elastic, so it won't come back down, which I find to be kind of funny. So then we can go ahead and create our Event Hub namespace. And this will take a little bit of a second. So what we're going to do is we'll pop over and take a look at some code. Here's some Avro data that I pulled down, and you can see how we've got our schema. And then there's some data that's kind of like compressed, and then there's some data that's just stored as plain text, and it gets kind of goofy. It's all right. So no, one moment. Trying to pull up the demo code. Okay. So here I have some Python code for creating events, and I'm using the standard library, and we can see that I'm importing from that 2 classes, right? I'm importing the Event Hub producer client, as well as event data, which is just it's a data object, right? And there's documentation about what properties it supports. And here I have a connection string, and the connection string both has so this is being recorded, I'll have to change this. But the connection string both has that URL for my namespace endpoint, and it also has a shared access key so that I can write to it. So that's how security is managed, is through shared access keys, and you can create them for producing events, consuming events, and for managing your Event Hub. Oh, I will have to check out the, let's see. That looks interesting. Oh, I don't know if I trust these people. Random fractals. I'll have to look into that at some point, but back to our demo. So here what I'm doing is I'm just creating a random number and I'm making a batch, and then I'm writing the event data to just plain text, and I'm writing it like a JSON format. But again, how I serialize the data is entirely up to me. And implied in this is the default text encoding of UTF-8 when it comes to Python data, right? And so here I'm basically just making this JSON data saying, okay, I've got a temperature sensor and it's got a certain reading. I'm making a batch, I'm adding to that batch, and then I'm sending it up. And normally you want a batch that's more than just one event, right? And so here I just run it for forever. And just every quarter of a second, I'm creating, uh-oh. Thought I had, maybe I broke everything. This is what I get for messing around during a demo. I apologize to everyone here. Let's go ahead.
All right.
No, I have that. Let's try it again. You know what? We're going to open that back up and hope that I didn't accidentally break everything.
So the latest releases of VS Code have these little dialogues that pop up that say, "Hey, do you trust stuff in this?" So it's been a little funky.
Yeah, well, I know this was working fine 2 days ago, but I probably messed things up by trying to install an extension during. Oh, what? Why is my Python path not valid? Why is it not? Oh, this is gonna kill me. Come on. Oh, there we go.
No folder open. Do you need to open up a certain folder?
No, I think it's just confused about when I told it to debug. So that seems to be,
Okay,
we're good now, right?
Good.
So we can see that's making the event. So I guess I need to hit run instead of run debug or something like that. So while that's creating a bunch of events, let's go ahead and go to the event hub the event hub namespace we created. We can see the schema registry down here, and we can create a new event hub. And this we can name whatever we want. It doesn't have to be unique. Should not have punctuation. And I can tell it, oh, I want to do data capture. I can tell it how many partitions I want. I can tell it how long I want to keep the events for. And I can say, okay, every 5 minutes, save the events. Every 300 megabytes, save the events. And you know what? I don't want these empty files to be saved. And then I can pick Azure Blob Storage. And I can pick the folder structure. And so either you're going to decide to do it based on the name, the year and the date, or on the naming. And so actually, I think you might be able to, let's see. Oh, those are samples, right? So I guess you could technically, you can customize it even. So why would you do it like this, right? Well, what makes sense is, let's say you're dealing with a data lake or whatnot. Maybe you want to be able to filter based on time, right? And you can do kind of pseudo filtering based on the folder format. And so that can be convenient. So that is creating, but we already have one of these baked in the oven, right? And so here we've got our Pluralsight hub, and we can go to our main hub. And what we're going to see is that the activity just suddenly spiked, right? And we can go to shared access policies, and we can get policy to send or to listen or whatnot. And the way this works is, again, is these shared access keys. So you have 2 keys and that's it. And I can regenerate them if I wanted to. And you get a connection string that's what we use to be able to talk to Azure Event Hubs. So now what we can do is I can open up a different file. mean, I'm the author. Why wouldn't I trust it? Anyway, so what I can do is I can run similar code. I included the blob checkpoint store because you're responsible for saving your progress. So Azure Event Hubs will kind of remember where you're at while you're pulling an event. So I'll give you the next one as you request it. But you're responsible for saving where you're at, especially if you have a failure and you need to reprocess an event, right? So that's on you. And so what I'm doing here is I'm receiving the partition information, the event, and I'm saying, okay, here's the output, right? And it's important, we have to remember, like, we have to specify the encoding because Azure Event Hubs doesn't do any of that work for us. So here, basically, I've got my main function and I'm specifying my checkpoint store. I'm creating a consumer client and passing in the connection string and all these details. I'm passing in what my consumer group is, which is basically what's my logical application ID. And then I'm just going to run through and print these for forever. So let's go ahead and try that. Let's see. Is it going to behave? Why does it not like me? Let's try. Oh man. We may have to stop that one and run this one. I don't know why it suddenly decided that it didn't like this. So let's try. We'll stop that. Let's see what the last readings were. 3, 10, 32, 73. So normally I'm able to do this in parallel, but you can see it's catching up with what was in the event hub. And then it's outputting those last ones. So let's see, was there anything else? Yeah, and so eventually that information gets saved to the change data capture. So we can go to storage and we can go to containers. You can even see the day that I did it on. Let's see if we can. All right, so it thinks it can read this now. So let's see. You know, I told it I installed a thing. But here we can, you know, we've got some of that data. And again, some of it's compressed, so we can't read it natively. Oh, it's activating the extension. Oh. I will be honest, I am not sure what this this data preview thinks it's doing. So that's a bit of a wah wah. But yeah, that's the gist of it. So Azure Event Hubs is it's a really useful tool for storing these little bits of information temporarily, and then having it land somewhere else whenever you're done with it. Cool. So I think we started 10 after, so got some time for questions and all of that. Again, I'm more than happy to hang out and answer any questions either related to Event Hubs or Power BI or consulting or any of that kind of stuff.
Hey, Eugene, I got 2 questions.
Yeah, please.
If you don't mind. So
Yeah.
the first was on the security. So is the shared access policy,
Oh.
is that the only way to give somebody rights to the event hub? Is like, could I use like an NT identity, or not NT, Active Directory identity, or any other type of credential?
I will double check, but my understanding is, yeah, that's the only way to do it. Now you can create separate policies. And so that way you don't have to have just one big shared one for everybody. But at least whenever I was looking into it, I didn't see anything tied to Azure Active Directory or any other option. I think it's very heavily aimed at developers and that sort of thing. but I'll double check on that.
Oh, no worries, that's fine. And then the actually maybe I had 3, but I'll just ask
No,
one and
it's
then
fine.
I'll do one later. With the when you're using the Kafka API, does that support the blob capture as well?
Yes, yeah. So
Okay.
the blob capture is associated with the Event Hub, not necessarily the API version that it's running on.
Okay.
Yep.
Cool.
Anyone else have any questions? More than happy to hang out for a little bit.
So I'll ask my last question if nobody's
Yeah.
going to go.
Go for it.
It's actually more of a Power Query thing. Do you
Okay.
know if, like, let's say I had like 6 different database servers and I wanted to use like a Power Query to go to each of those servers and pull results back, but I wanted to do it dynamically so that like tomorrow if I add 2 more servers, I could have a table that would drive that. Is that something that you've tried to do before or had any success with?
So I've done that with Excel files. Excel's
Okay.
like a database, right?
Yep.
So the way that would work, it honestly, it wouldn't be too bad. The only thing I would be concerned about is if there's any issues with running like dynamic Power Query, because sometimes that can be limited, like in the service and that sort of thing. But the way that would work is, you would have your table of database servers in that case, because if it was just one, you would parameterize it with a Power Query parameter.
Right.
And then you would run your query against it. So it'd use like the SQL.database command or whatever it is. There's a command that lets you run kind of arbitrary queries or allows you to pull in like a list of tables or what have you. And so it would, whatever was going on there would return the result as kind of a cell that's filled with a table of data, if that makes sense. And then you would expand out that column. It's a bit hard to explain verbally, but I've done that before when it comes to expanding out a list of Excel files. So I had a customer where he had a bunch of arbitrarily named Excel files, like they all started with a certain prefix, and he wanted to grab a table in each of them that had a certain name. And so it's actually straightforward to do in practice. It's kind of confusing because Power Query treats everything as like tables and cells and that sort of stuff. And so you just have to get used to that kind of approach. But that's the way that I would do it. Is I would first write my Power Query code, and do a test query or something like that. And then I'd either turn that into a function, or if it's just something simple where you're running a single SQL query, then I'd figure out what the 1 or 2 lines of Power Query code are for that. And then you would have it so it's applying it to each row in your list of servers. So
got it. Okay.
Yep.
Cool. Thanks.
Yeah, no problem.
Hey, Eugene.
Yeah.
Can you, on your share screen, can you go back to where it was showing the output format?
Yeah, 100%. You mean for the data capture bit, or are you talking about the raw?
Not the raw.
Avro, or are you talking about like
The
how it saves it?
How it saves it.
Okay, yeah, sure thing.
It looked like it was basically populating a directory structure. Am I right?
Oh yeah. So you have control over that. So let me see. If we go to capture.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we're in control of that directory structure, right? So you can see the preview here. And so for the one that I've already created, it's going namespace, event hub, partition, year, month, day, hour, minute, second.
And you can
go ahead.
Well, you can put that in blob storage or in I think Databricks and whatnot. So it looks like that could be useful in a big data partitionable directory structure.
Yeah, that's the idea, is that you want to have it in the kind of structure. So a lot of times you might decide to go with like a year-based format first, like that. For that specific reason, right? So it's designed in such a way that it supports big data, because you think about it, you're saving it to these files and you're saving it to an Avro format. And so that makes a lot of sense for like the whole data lake approach. And again, because Azure Event Hub it's a temporary home for your data. And so we can go ahead and look real quick at the way that it kind of lands, right? Containers. But yeah, like you said, it's just the directory structure, and you have control over how that's shaped. And so here we have our little Avro file that we could download or you could read with something. Now, the thing is with Databricks, there's no direct way to, how do I put this? There's no good way to push it to Databricks or anything like that, right? The data capture just saves it to either Blob Storage or Data Lake Gen 2 storage, which is Blob Storage, right? What you can do is in Databricks, you can either then read off of that storage potentially, or you can use the Java library for Event Hubs to read from it straight if you want the streaming data kind of approach.
Okay.
But in terms of integrations, the only good integrations that I'm aware of is there's good integration for Azure Stream Analytics, and then there's integration for the data capture piece with Blob Storage and Data Lake Storage.
Okay.
Everything else, I think you have to do a little bit of legwork.
But less legwork.
Yes. They've made the libraries for you. They've made your life a lot easier, for sure.
Yeah.
Cool. Happy to answer the most random questions. If anyone else has any questions, otherwise I'll let you all head out a couple minutes early.
No, great job.
Thank you. Yeah, it's always interesting when you're kind of expanding out into something new for yourself, right? Like I think I probably did my course like a year ago, but just trying to learn about some of this data engineering stuff, because I think that's going to have a good bit of a long-term lifespan for me in my career.
Mm-hmm. I know it's hard to do applause on Zoom, but here you go.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. Yeah.
Thank you, Eugene.
Yeah, you're very welcome.
Great stuff, Eugene.
Yes.
Yep.
Thanks all.
Thank you.
I'm going to go ahead and hit stop.
Okay. All right, now